Taiwan's legislature elects its new speaker. A Human Rights Watch report says car makers are complicit in forced labor in China. Top social media executives get grilled by the U.S. Senate. Plus, what's the takeaway from Taiwan's recent military drills? We speak to a defense expert to find out. Welcome to another edition of TaiwanPlus News. I'm Leslie Liao. Thanks for joining us. Taiwan's newly elected legislators have been sworn in, and their first task has been choosing the head of the legislature. Louise Watt reports.
After 2 rounds of voting, it's official. Taiwan's next speaker is Han Kuo-yu, a result that's set to shake up the legislature and make it harder for President-elect Lai Ching-te to get his agenda through. Han is from the Kuomintang, or KMT. For the past 8 years, it's been the main opposition party. Now it has the most seats in the legislature, no majority, but enough to get Han elected.
我相信广大的台湾人民期待一个认真问政、合作团结的立法院，心心念念都是为台湾老百姓来谋福利。
He beat the previous speaker, Yo Si-kun, from Lai's party, and the third-party candidate, Huang Shanshan. Her party abstained from the second round of voting, and Han won with a simple majority. Han is a controversial figure in Taiwan. A populist politician, he lost the presidential race to Tsai Ing-wen in 2020, and was then recalled as mayor of Kaohsiung City because voters felt he abandoned them. When Han was mayor, he traveled to China and met with officials from the Chinese Communist Party, raising questions of what his priority will be when he's speaker, whether he will try to reach out to China or do what his predecessor did and use the role to boost Taiwan's diplomacy and profile with Western nations. Patrick Chen and Louise Watt at Taiwan's legislature for TaiwanPlus.
After Han was elected speaker, Johnny Jiang of the KMT was voted in as deputy speaker. Han Kuo-yu is a household name here in Taiwan, and he may be familiar to some people overseas. From his time as Kaohsiung mayor to when he challenged President Tsai Ing-wen for top office, Joyce Tseng recaps the KMT politician's career so far.
小老鹰在飞，下面有野狐狸在赶，切记，一言一行。
Han Kuo-yu. He's the boisterous politician who's been grabbing national headlines for decades. He's now landed his most influential role yet. The Kuomintang politician has survived scandals, a mayoral recall, and a spectacular presidential election loss to Tsai Ing-wen in 2020. Now he will serve as Taiwan's legislative speaker.
It will be very interesting to see how this pans out. Han, he's a very affable and charismatic man. He has a very solid support base. Many in the KMT are very fond of him. On the other hand, he has a reputation for not being necessarily very diplomatic, speaking off the cuff and making gaffes, which may make it a little bit harder for him to maintain the neutrality and the diplomatic nature of the position of Speaker of the Legislature.
Han's opening political stint was as a lawmaker in 1992. In the very chamber he will now head. This is when he first entered the spotlight after assaulting then-fellow lawmaker Chen Shui-bian, hospitalizing the future president. After laying low for years, Han re-emerged in 2018 to run for Kaohsiung City mayor, in a race seen as a surefire win for rival party, the DPP. Just 3 months later, he shifted gear to bid for Taiwan's top office against incumbent President Tsai Ing-wen, but he lost, and by a large margin. Then another blow. Kaohsiung residents voted Han out as mayor, the first in Taiwan's democratic history. Analysts back then said it would be hard for the KMT to bounce back.
国民党不管怎么讲，你们需要去找另外一个 superstar。今天这个输掉了，被罢免掉了。在这种状况之下，国民党要在废墟上面呢重新站起来，确确实实是不容易的。
Today, the opposition party is still fighting to stay relevant after losing the presidential race to give the ruling DPP a historic third straight term in office, while a third reformist party continues to gain influence. But the KMT's role in local politics is far from over, having won the most seats in the country's legislature, giving it the speakership. Now, with tough-talking Han at the helm, the stage is set for some lively debates over the country's future. James Lin and Joyce Sun for TaiwanPlus.
Shortly after Han Kuo-yu was voted in as legislative speaker, current speaker Liao announced his resignation as legislator at large for the DPP. Liao made the announcement on Facebook. He's held the speakership since 2020 after being elected as a party list legislator. Before becoming a lawmaker, Liao was chair of the DPP. He also served as premier under President Chen Shui-bian. Liao's legislative seat will be filled in by the next member on the DPP's party list, Hope Foundation chair and cancer doctor Wang Zenshu. Has your car contributed to the repression of Uyghur Muslims in China? A new report from Human Rights Watch says most likely. The report details the links between the global car industry and forced labor in Chinese aluminum production. Aluminum is a key component for the car industry. China's Xinjiang region is home to the country's Uyghur ethnic minority. The region currently produces 10% of the world's aluminum, which Human Rights Watch says happens because of forced labor. To hear more about human rights abuses in China's auto industry, Harrell Hughes spoke to Elaine Pearson, Asia Director of Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch has just released a report detailing the links between forced labor in China and the global car industry, specifically in the production of aluminum. What more can you tell us?
Well, we have seen the steady deterioration of human rights in Xinjiang since 2017, basically since the Chinese government enacted its Strike Hard campaign. In reality, what it has meant is that there are crimes against humanity being committed against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, including arbitrary detention, torture, forced labor. So we've really looked at the extent of forced labor transfers in Xinjiang region. We know that 10% of the world's aluminium is smelted in Xinjiang. And over the last 10 years, we've really seen the export of cars and car parts double from China. And there's a real risk that even if the cars are being manufactured in other parts of China, that aluminium ultimately is coming from Xinjiang.
How confident can consumers be when buying a car that it does not contribute to this forced labor?
Well, unfortunately, I think there is a really significant risk that if your car is coming from China, or even if it's not coming from China, but it has parts that are coming from China, that it could be tainted with forced labor. I think consumers have a really critical role to play in asking both car companies to ensure that they map the supply chain, but also demanding that their governments prohibit the import of goods made with forced labor. Some governments are starting to take action on this. The EU has a new due diligence law and a new forced labor law. The US has a very strong law prohibiting the import of goods from Xinjiang, but it's also about enforcement, and it's about ensuring that these laws that are on the books are enforced.
Some of the largest car companies in the world have partnerships, deals, and even factories in China. And Human Rights Watch has offered recommendations to these companies. What is their role in this?
So we selected 5 car companies that, are really the 5 largest in terms of car parts and car manufacturing in China. In several cases, we got responses or we engaged with those companies, and they talked a lot about the difficulties and the challenges in mapping the supply chain. Or they also claimed that if they have joint ventures with Chinese partners, that it's not their responsibility. And frankly, we don't think that response is good enough. We think that there's a whole lot of things that global car companies can do. If the aluminium is coming from Xinjiang, or if the car companies don't know, then I think they're failing to really minimize the risk that cars are being manufactured with forced labor.
That was Harrell Hughes speaking with Human Rights Watch Asia Director Elaine Pearson. Chief executives of social media giants Meta, X, TikTok, Snap, and Discord have faced tough questions about companies' efforts to combat online sexual exploitation at a U.S. Senate hearing. Rosie Greninger has the story.
Called to the U.S. Senate for another hearing, social media executives were confronted with images of children who've been victim to online sexual abuse.
I was sexually exploited on Instagram.
I was sexually exploited on X.
The leaders of X, Snap, Meta, TikTok, and Discord faced a 4-hour grilling by US lawmakers about the risk their products pose to young people. As efforts to regulate social media ramp up amid concerns there's not enough being done to keep kids safe online. The senators say these tech executives have failed to protect children from sexual predators on their platforms, with statistics showing sextortion has skyrocketed by 87% since 2019.
You and the companies before us, I know you don't mean it to be so, but you have blood on your hands. You have a product. You have a product that's killing people.
Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who runs Facebook and Instagram, was prompted to apologize to families who say their children have suffered or died as a result of social media.
Let me ask you this. There's families of victims here today. Have you apologized to the victims? Would you like to do so now?
I'm sorry for everything that you've all been through. No one should have to go through the things that your families have suffered. And this is why we invested so much and are going to continue doing industry-leading efforts to make sure that no one has to go through the types of things that your families have had to suffer.
At the heart of these modern-day concerns are the lack of legislation to regulate social media companies and the extent of China's access to social media data. TikTok CEO Shou Chu repeatedly questioned about his ties to China and the CCP.
So, you said today, as you often say, that you live in Singapore. Of what nation are you a citizen?
Singapore.
Are you a citizen of any other nation?
No, Senator.
Have you ever applied for Chinese citizenship?
Senator, I served my nation in Singapore. No, I did not.
Have you ever been a member of the Chinese Communist Party?
Senator, I'm Singaporean. No.
While Snap and X both agreed to support a proposed Kids Online Safety Act, TikTok is pledging $3 billion on trust and safety efforts, and Meta is promising to work to prevent online abuse. But despite several of these hearings rallying for online safety, there's still no legislated change, leaving parents and lawmakers frustrated at the seeming lack of urgency to pass meaningful laws to hold platforms accountable. Dolphin Chen and Rosie Greninger for TaiwanPlus.
Coming up, we take a look at the civil war in Myanmar 3 years on. Stay tuned. We bring you stories from Taiwan.
Every day of the week.
Our reporters travel the nation.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
News from here in Taiwan and around the world.
What's up, Taiwan? On TaiwanPlus.
Welcome back. After that quick break, you're watching TaiwanPlus News. The military says 33 Chinese warplanes were spotted around the country on Thursday, the most recorded this year. Most of those planes stayed close to China, but among the group, 14 aircraft breached Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. This is an area that is used for defensive purposes and not the country's airspace. China sends military aircraft and warships around Taiwan to test the country's defenses. Taiwan's military says it deployed forces in response and is monitoring the situation. Those incursions come as Taiwan wraps up 2 days of military exercises around the country. Our reporter Jaime Okan spoke to Kelly Greco, a security analyst in Washington, D.C., to find out how useful these drills are.
So Taiwan's military has just wrapped up these exercises ahead of the Lunar New Year. And one of the first drills involved these C-130 airplanes, these really big transport aircraft that play a huge role in providing logistics for Taiwan. But in the event of a conflict, How applicable is this kind of drill?
The first red flag I have there is what airfields do they believe they're going to be using in wartime that will not be destroyed by Chinese missiles to be able to move material that way? To me, that's just not going to be a viable way to do it. So they need to be thinking about other ways to do that, whether that's, having convoys and thinking about how to create decoys in terms of vehicles on the ground. Ukraine has been quite successful at that, about using decoys in that way. But I think what's really important is to practice in these exercises things that are actually going to be viable in wartime. And C-130s, for example, is something that doesn't strike me as particularly viable.
Another exercise that Taiwan conducted simulated how it would plant sea mines in the ocean in the Taiwan Strait. How applicable is that kind of drill in the sense of pushing more towards that asymmetric strategy?
One of the things that is useful about sea mines is they're relatively cheap. And, you can deploy them in different ways, including, you easily deploy them just from ships themselves. And it doesn't have to be even a military vessel. If you have training, you can train civilian fishermen how to, put these over. But one of the things that's really useful about sea mines is that they can really delay an adversary because China has the same problem that the United States would have in a mining area, where you have to clear the mines, or you have to at least clear a portion of them so your vessels can get through. And the reality is there's not an easy way to do that really quickly. It simply takes time. But time is the one thing that Taiwan is going to want to try to create if it finds itself in a conflict.
And I just want to get your thoughts on this, Kelly, in the sense of the direction that Taiwan is going in terms of these military exercises. Is this more for show, or are these actually applicable if a conflict were to happen?
Well, I think what I would say is, first of all, is that logistics is incredibly important in war. And there's a tendency sometimes to focus on the shiny objects, the things that shoot, and the new technology and what it can do. But none of that matters if you don't keep weapons armed with ammunition, you don't keep soldiers fed. That stuff doesn't really matter. And we can see that in the Ukraine war. One of the real advantages Ukraine has had relative to Russia is that they've been much better at logistics. Logistics has been a major weakness for the Russians. So it's really fundamental to war, even if it's not the most sexy of topics. And I think exercising that's the closest you can get to an actual conflict situation without conflict, but practicing that, because there's so much you learn by actually trying to do that.
That was Kelly Greco, a security analyst from the Stimson Center, speaking to our reporter Jaime Okan. Myanmar's military has extended a state of emergency 1 day before the 3rd anniversary of a coup that plunged the country into turmoil. The junta has found itself on the back foot in recent months as it struggles to contain a pro-democracy rebellion that's gaining strength. Rick Liao reports.
Pro-democracy fighters in central Myanmar battling with military forces. 3 years after the country's generals ousted elected leaders, thousands here have taken up arms to form a resistance. Across the country, pro-democracy militias like this are gaining ground against the junta.
This civil war in Myanmar has become unwinnable for the Myanmar junta. And that means that it's a matter of time before they lose this war. I mean, they're losing troops on a daily basis, no new recruits, no reinforcements, no resupply. So soldiers are not willing to do patrols anymore. They get ambushed and so on. And the upper hand now has gone to the resistance forces.
The junta is still in control of the capital and other major cities. But the elected leaders they ousted are waiting to return to power and build a new federal democracy.
This is once and for all to end the dictatorship in Myanmar, to that the military never come to the politics of the country.
The violence is causing a humanitarian crisis largely overlooked internationally. More than 6,000 civilians have been killed since the coup, and 2.3 million people have been displaced. These numbers could increase as the military loses ground. There are fears the generals would lash out on civilian targets.
Life will be more challenging than before because
more or less likely regime will try to drop bombs to their towns. So there will be more and more civilian casualties.
The balance of power may be shifting here, and for many, a post-military Myanmar finally looks within reach. But until full control is wrestled from the generals, the country's people will continue to pay a high price in their battle for democracy. Alex Chen and Rick Liao for TaiwanPlus.
To find out more about how the conflict in Myanmar is impacting civilians, our reporter Laurel Stewart spoke to Manny Mong from Human Rights Watch.
It's been 3 years since the military coup in Myanmar, but there's been an increase in violence against civilians since anti-junta operations stepped up last year. What is the situation civilians are facing right now?
Well, it's really dire. We have something like 18 million people that have been identified as in immediate need of aid. Just in the last few months as well, since these October offensives, we have 2.6 million newly displaced people inside the country. First of all, we've seen these waves of airstrikes since the offensives in October. And we just have to remember that these anti-junta offences are happening in the first instance because of the coup and the military's actions against civilians in these areas. But it's really telling, the use of the disproportionate and indiscriminate attacks that the military employs, because it really does show a blatant disregard for human life. And again, you know, targeting civilians is just part of that collective punishment that seems to be a pattern that they use to really, really instill fear.
Right. And you just mentioned some really horrific statistics about people who've been displaced and people who are in need of aid. What is the aid situation like right now?
It's really coming down to the fact that the military itself is responsible for it again, because they are blocking aid routes. They're not allowing humanitarian actors into areas. They're not allowing people to leave. So quite often in times of increased conflict, people are stuck where the conflict is heaviest. And that's also how people are getting trapped in these airstrikes as well.
The UN's Commissioner for Human Rights says there's insufficient world attention on this conflict. What would sufficient world attention look like?
I guess the problem is that there are other major conflicts happening right now. Of course, Palestine, Israel, and the Ukraine, Afghanistan. So Myanmar is a country that has traditionally not received that much interest. What we found again is that where there have been more frequent outages or rolling out constant outages, that's where the worst abuses are happening. And the problem is, of course, the information isn't coming out. So when we're saying that there isn't enough international attention, this is partly because there isn't information coming out and therefore isn't able to grab the attention of the international audience. However, I do think that regionally, Myanmar is so significant. The attention that's been paid to them at the UN Security Council level or at government levels is still fairly high. But we just haven't seen the movement in terms of the penalties or the sanctions that we would like put in place by the UN and governments who are interested in Myanmar.
Once again, that was Manny Mong from Human Rights Watch speaking to Laurel Stewart. Japan is known for its cafes with cuddly critters, and now ones featuring mini pigs are rising in popularity. Eric Liao takes a look.
Hogging the spotlight. These micro pigs live at a cafe in Tokyo where they attract tons of visitors. Lots of people come to snuggle with the tiny trotters.
豚さんは犬猫ちゃんと比べると大きく違う点が人懐っこいっていったところで、カフェでは基本的に豚さん人の膝の上でまったりしています。
The piggies are super popular, with the cafe expanding to 10 branches in the last few years. Little porkers are very friendly, love the attention, and often compete for lap space.
But we just thought the pig cafe was a little bit different. Yeah, something that the kids wouldn't always get to hold and pet.
Oh, they're just so cute. So tiny and so small, and kind of want to take one home now.
Japan is known for its animal cafes, letting visitors interact with common pets like cats, dogs, and rabbits, and also more exotic animals like owls, hedgehogs, or even snakes. It's not just their cuteness that attracts people. Playing with animals can be good for a person's well-being.
There is mounting evidence that associating with and owning pets can provide mental health and physical health benefits for people. It suggests that there's also mental health benefits in terms of decreasing stress hormones, more of a feeling of well-being. In terms of how they do these things, that remains to be determined.
While these interactions are good for people, there are some concerns about how the animals do. Animal rights activists say more regulation may be needed for this industry.
I think, again, ethical sourcing of the animals, what happens when the animals leave the cafe. I think all these things are important considerations. And I think it does come down probably to government regulation.
These piggies, at least, are very well loved, and they'll keep welcoming visitors and looking for laps to lay on.
This one's literally asleep.
John Su and Eric Gao for TaiwanPlus.
Thanks for watching TaiwanPlus News. Before we go, loosen up with these samba dancers rehearsing for Brazil's annual Carnival parade in Rio de Janeiro. I'm Liao. Take care, and I'll see you next time.